Donald Trump did something previously unthinkable in the West. Rather than pressure opponents, he openly pressured his own allies. Not diplomatically, not quietly, but through ultimatums, tariffs, and open pressure. Suddenly it turns out that the biggest threat to Western unity may no longer be Russia or China, but decisions coming directly from Washington. This video is not about one country, nor about one island. It's about what happens to the West when its leader starts acting like its opponent. To understand why this step is unprecedented, we need to look at exactly what Trump did. Trump's move is not just another trade episode or a negotiation tactic. This is a fundamental change in the logic by which the West has operated for decades. So far, the United States has mostly relied on tariffs, sanctions, and economic pressure against rivals like Russia, China, or Iran. Now, those tools are being used internally within the alliance. Since February, Washington has been imposing 10% tariffs on several European countries that refuse to support the American approach regarding Greenland. At the same time, however, a clear ultimatum was issued. If an agreement to purchase the island is not reached by June 1st, the tariffs are set to rise to 25%. It's not just about the numbers themselves or about a trade measure. It's about a precedent. The United States is making it clear that an ally's disagreement is dealt with using the same tools as an opponent's resistance. At this point, the customs decision becomes a strategic turning point with consequences for the entire West. Greenland is more than a large island or an exotic geopolitical curiosity. It is strategically vital for Europe and NATO. It lies at the crossroads of the North Atlantic and the Arctic, in an area that is increasingly important in terms of military presence, control of air and maritime space, as well as future resource routes. That's why Greenland has never been seen as an ordinary object of trade between states, but as part of the security architecture of the West. When the United States suggests that it wants to buy the island, it not only causes political disagreement in Europe, but also concerns about setting a precedent. If one NATO country were to openly push for a change in the territorial status of another member of the alliance or its partner, it would undermine the basic principle on which NATO stands, that the borders and sovereignty of allies are not subject to pressure. At this point, Greenland becomes a red line. It's not about the island itself, but about what trading it would mean for the trust, balance, and internal cohesion of the West. What makes this situation unique is not the existence of the targets themselves, but the way they are used. Sanctions, tariffs, and restrictions have been used to weaken Russia, Iran, or China. Tariffs are now more than a trade tool. They're a political weapon. This isn't negotiation or compromise, but a way to send a clear message. Non-compliance will lead to punishment, and the June 1st deadline adds more pressure. Europe has no time for lengthy negotiations and must respond quickly under the threat of escalation. This clearly shows the difference between an alliance and a power hierarchy. The economic tools that were supposed to protect the common interests of the West are turning into a means of internal pressure. And once this line is crossed, it's no longer easy to return to the original rules of the game. What we're witnessing today is no longer an ordinary dispute between allies. It's the collapse of the certainty that the West has stood on for decades. The United States, the states, and Europe are still officially allies. The treaties are in force, NATO exists, the articles are written, but in practice, something new and extremely dangerous is emerging: doubt. For the first time in years, European governments are questioning if they can actually rely on the United States during a crisis, not just in theory. When the country that is supposed to be the guarantor of security starts using tools of pressure against its own allies, trust falls apart. Tariffs, ultimatums, and time pressure create an atmosphere where you can't plan, only react. And in security policy, predictability is key. The result is chaos. Not chaos in the sense of open conflict, but chaos in decision-making, in planning, and in trust. Europe is still formally in the alliance, but it no longer has certainty that the United States would act automatically in a serious crisis. What held true for generations, that an attack on one is an attack on all, has not suddenly disappeared legally, but politically. And once the political will disappears, paper guarantees lose their strength. This is exactly where the spiral of escalation begins. Every further step increases distrust. Every action provokes a reaction. Europe must start preparing for scenarios that it couldn't even imagine just a few years ago. Meanwhile, the United States is undermining its leadership of the West, not with a single decision, but by gradually eroding the trust that was built over decades and is now falling apart within a matter of months. The biggest problem in this situation is not the tariffs themselves or the dispute over Greenland. The problem is the precedent. NATO worked for decades, not because it had perfect treaties, but because there was political certainty. The United States was seen as the ultimate guarantor, not as an actor that conditioned solidarity on trade or territorial demands. This principle is now being undermined. Joint exercises continue and diplomats repeat familiar statements about unity, but a crack has formed in the system. If the United States is willing to exert economic and political pressure on its allies in times of peace, the question arises as to how they would behave in times of crisis. This question is existential for NATO. The alliance relies on an automatic response, assuming help will come without negotiation, conditions, or consideration of short-term benefits. If this automatic response disappears, NATO changes from a security guarantee to a discussion forum, and that's a fundamental difference. Opponents of the West closely watch not just public statements, but also what's implied between the lines. For Europe, this means rethinking its core certainties, not because it wants to weaken the alliance, but because it cannot afford to remain in a state of strategic uncertainty. For the United States, it means something even more serious. A gradual loss of the position of a leader whose word holds without the need for pressure. What is happening today between the United States and Europe is not an isolated dispute. It is a global signal. World powers do not judge the West by statements, but by behavior. And the behavior of the United States in recent months sends a clear message. The internal cohesion of the West is no longer a given. For Russia, this is an ideal situation. It doesn't have to do anything dramatic. It just needs to wait and watch as transatlantic relations fracture internally. Every dispute between the United States and Europe weakens the credibility of deterrence, which is the biggest obstacle for Moscow. If Europe starts to doubt automatic American support, Russia gains room to maneuver, politically, militarily, and psychologically. China is watching this situation even more closely. For Beijing, the unity of the West is a key limit to its global ambitions. If the United States treats Europe as an adversary rather than a partner, China gets confirmation that the Western Bloc is not solid, but fragile and divisible. This has consequences from Taiwan to global trade. It's also a strong signal for smaller countries globally. Countries that relied on the West as a stable partner now see that even allied relationships can be questioned overnight by lies, ultimatums, or power demands. This hurts the West's reputation, not its military, but its soft power. This leads to a world with increasing uncertainty, not because someone is preparing for an immediate conflict, but because predictability is falling apart. And in international politics, predictability is one of the main pillars of stability. Even if tariffs were lifted and the Greenland dispute formally ended, the damage is done because the key event happened openly, not behind the scenes. The United States has shown that it is willing to use economic and political pressure against its own allies to pursue strategic goals. And that is a precedent that cannot be erased. Europe will remember for many years that in a critical moment, the United States of America acted not as a guarantor of stability, but as a player pursuing its own interests regardless of the consequences for the alliance. This will lead to caution, to diversification of security, and to the search for alternatives, even if formal alliances remain intact. Donald Trump may have been pursuing a short-term political or strategic goal with this move. He also started a spiral that won't be easy to stop. A spiral of distrust, escalation, and fragmentation in the West. This issue goes beyond a single dispute, decision, or ultimatum. It's a moment when it became clear that what had held for decades could fall apart in just a few months. And once this line is crossed, going back is no longer a matter of one president, but of an entire generation.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a tip. To help the video reach more people, please click praise. Thanks.